Well, welcome back. It's been a little while since we shot one of these videos, as you can see, but we're in John chapter 11, which contains one of the more well-known stories in the book of John, the resurrection of Lazarus. We know that Jesus raised several people from the dead. There are a few of these resurrection stories in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus raises a widow's son. And in Matthew chapter 9, he brings an official's daughter back to life. But the resurrection of Lazarus is the longest one of those stories. We get the most detail in this. And it contains a few key statements from Jesus about himself and about life after death. So I'll try to summarize the story as best I can, and then we'll take a look at a couple of key verses. The first few verses of chapter 11 tell us that Lazarus, who is from the village of Bethany, is sick. And it tells us that his sisters are Mary and Martha. And these three siblings apparently have a history with Jesus. There's a different story about Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10. And then in the next chapter, John chapter 12, there's another story about Mary where she anoints Jesus' feet. And John mentions that here in verse 2. So Lazarus is sick. His sisters send word to their friend Jesus. And Jesus says in verse 4 that this sickness will not end in death. And then he stays where he is for 2 more days. He doesn't go right away in response to this news. When he does decide to go, his disciples ask him if he's concerned about going back to Judea, to southern Israel, because he was recently, there was a crowd that tried to stone him there. And he responds by saying that people who walk in the light don't stumble. Only people who walk in the dark stumble. And what he's doing is he's reassuring them that the steps he takes are guided by his heavenly Father. When we are in the will of God, we don't have to worry about things going wrong. And then he says in verse 11, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. So this is now the second time that Jesus has predicted how this story is going to end. This sickness will not end in death, and I will wake him up. And this also teaches us something about how Jesus views death. He calls it sleep. For those who belong to him, it's not this permanent thing that we think it is. In fact, his disciples are confused and they think he means natural sleep. He has to clarify for them what he means. He says, Lazarus is dead, and that he's glad that he wasn't there so that they might believe. So for Jesus, this whole situation is just not nearly as dire as everyone else thinks it is. And this statement is kind of similar to what we saw in John chapter 9, where he said that the man's blindness was so that God's glory might be displayed in his life. Well, the story goes on from there. When he arrives, the sisters rebuke him for not having been there, saying that if he had been there, then Lazarus would not have died. And then Jesus goes on and visits the tomb. He tells them to roll away the stone. Martha objects and says there will be an odor at this point because Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. But Jesus says, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? He prays to the Father. He says he knows that the Father hears him. He says that he's praying out loud for the benefit of those watching so that they may believe. So again, this whole episode for Jesus is an opportunity to show who he is. We think of raising someone from the dead as this great big impossibility, but that is because we think within the laws that govern this universe, things like the laws of physics. But God is the creator of this universe. He's the giver of life. And for him, it's no more difficult to raise Lazarus from the dead than it was to give him life the first time. And so if Jesus can do this, then it proves that he's God. And he does. They open the tomb and Lazarus comes out. So that's the story. Now let me just point out a couple of key verses. First, there's the interaction between Jesus and Martha starting in verse 21. And let me just read verses 21 through 27 for you. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Now there's a ton in there worth noting. I'll be brief. To begin with, Martha just gets several things right. She knows that God will give Jesus whatever he asks. She knows there will be a resurrection at the last day. She knows that Jesus is the Messiah. She calls him the Son of God. But Jesus' words in verses 25 and 26 are really the key verses in this chapter. First, you have, I am the resurrection and the life. This is the fifth of those 7 I am statements that we've been paying attention to throughout this book. We've seen, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the door, and I am the good shepherd. And here, Martha knows there is a resurrection. Jesus says he is the resurrection. The only reason there is a resurrection at all is because of Jesus. There is no resurrection, there is no life after death apart from him. And he says he's the life. We've already talked about how he is the bread of life and the water of life. He has described himself as being essential if we want to have real life, we want to have spiritual life. And now he just calls himself the life. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 14, and we see him say in verse 6 that he is the way and the truth and the life. But going on in this passage, Jesus says, the one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And those statements seem slightly contradictory. They sort of seem to be opposed to each other. If you believe in him, you'll live even though you'll die, but then you'll never die. But Jesus is talking about 2 different types of death. If we believe in him, we will still experience physical death, but we won't experience spiritual death. And not only that, but our spiritual life will be continuous. It'll be uninterrupted when we die. There's no indication of any kind of soul sleep or anything like that in Jesus' words. It'll be one continuous experience of life. The soul will leave the body and be with Jesus, which is really good news. And then the one other thing you don't want to miss in this story is the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, Jesus wept. When Jesus sees his friend's tomb and when he sees the grief of the people around him, he's moved. His heart is broken, just like ours is when we face death, even though he knows how this story is going to end. So that just shows us that when someone dies, grief is right. Grief is appropriate. Even though as believers we know the end of the story, it still hurts. And Jesus knows what that pain is like, which is also really good news, I think. So that's the story of Lazarus, and we will look at the rest of chapter 11 in the next video.